te awanui. Kiwi, te iwi, Pipe, te hapu, and me, I'm John Pipe. Now, I've done that to you in Māori as best I can. That's my pepiha, because that's what Māori do, and it's something that is a lot of Europeans not comfortable with. So what I'm going to do for you is I've got 3 or 4 goals in this session. One is to give you some ideas about the treaty and how it relates to today and how it relates to PTC 3 in particular. I'm also going to give you some little exercises where you stop from time to time and interact with your neighbours, which is about formative assessment. And I'm also going to try and give you something about my own story, where I've come from, and you'll see the links on the screen in relation to that. So I'm going to start off by telling you in English something about me, myself. I was born and raised in Parihaka, so I'm sort of an Aucklander, and I'm one of 4 boys, post-war baby boomer, and no sisters but 4 boys, and I'm the number 2. My oldest brother Robert, he is a technology teacher, or was just retired at Longmata Area School, but for 25 years he was a plumber, and he decided to go into teaching when he was about 40. So I'm number 2. Number 3 is Richard, my brother, and he runs a technology company which digitises books, and he operates that company from Bubba's shop in Onehunga Mall, but the company's based in India. So he's sort of a very modern person, and this stuff is, he's actually ironically digitises quite a lot of stuff on Māori history for Bridget Williams' books, which is really interesting. And the younger brother Philip, he lives in Brisbane with his wife, who's Samoan, and he is a caregiver for the elderly. My own immediate family is Diane, my wife, is head of English at Dilworth School, and my children are Stephen, oldest boy 27, and he is a Muay Thai fighter, a personal trainer, and he works out of a place called The Lab in Bangkok. Second son David is just doing his OE, and he and his partner have gone to London, so they've just got a job as a computer programmer in London. And the third child, Christina, she is 23, and she works for BNZ as a customer services person. Oh, we've got a dog called Jack. Jack's 13, but he's sort of getting a bit old now. He's a little Jack Russell Terrier. And that's actually quite a nice place to just tell you a little story about that same sort of theme, really, because my own journey, and you'll see that on the slide, because I'll put a link. When you get the electronic version of this, you'll see there's a link to a website that I've got that tells a lot more about my personal story that relates to this presentation I'm doing today. I call it the ignore, and it's about overcoming the ignore. It's about overcoming my reticence, even as a historian, about New Zealand history. And I think that's part of the kind of genesis of this presentation today. So that unpacks it further, but there's one really quite pivotal story, and it was when I was working for Team Solutions immediately before I started here at MAGS, and I went to this presentation from April Parata, and she's the sister of Hekia Parata, who was the Minister of Education. And she was telling us that when she was principal of Ngata Memorial College in Ruatoria, she had a young geography teacher there, just been made head of department, and he was really struggling with the Māori students in his school because he said, I just can't get through to them. And she said, well, you've got to start telling them something about yourself. And so he did this, and he went away and he started talking to the class, and he said, well, look, my name's, whatever his name was, and I'm a boy from Canterbury, from Christchurch, and I went to University of Canterbury, and I did a degree in geography, and then did a master's, and met my wife there, and she had done a BA like me, and we got married, and we had a child, and then we came up to Ruatoria on promotion. We'd been at Shirley Boys High School, we decided to go on promotion and got to Ruatoria at this school there, and we decided, since we were out in a rural area of New Zealand, that we'd buy a dog. And at that, one kid put his hand up and said, we've got a dog, because that's the point of connection. And that's what I call getting the dog. That's why I always mention Jack, because it's getting the dog is what we're really interested in with the kids, in our relationships with them, finding what that dog is, because that's often the only point of intersection, is something about you that you have to share with your kids. So let's have a look at the start. As I said before, to understand the context of this, and keep in mind, and you'll see when you see my story, that I came to it really late. You know, as a history teacher, I started in 1975, so I am really old, but I don't make any apologies for that. I didn't come to teaching New Zealand history though until 1988. Now I've talked to Jaleesa about this and to Jenna, a couple of you, because it's actually quite important to me that now I'm sort of trying to overcome that. I'm sharing my journey with you so that you can understand that not all history teachers end up teaching material, subjects, content that you actually don't know much about. So your first year teaching, you're teaching about unification of Germany and unification of Italy, and really you have to bone up the night before. You don't generally have that if you're a science teacher, because you know your stuff, you know, but in history you do. So I want to show, because I've developed this argument called the ignore. And the argument of this basically is that for 100 years, from about 1880 to 1980, the treaty has been institutionally ignored. So in other words, when I started teaching in 1975, which is right at the end of that 100-year period, we never did anything to do with the treaty. When I was at secondary school, we never touched the treaty. We didn't do anything, and I went to Onehunga High School, but we had nothing to do with the treaty at all. So it's interesting to note that something has happened in the latter half of the 20th century, which means that institutionally, through PTCs, for example, all of a sudden we have to know something about the treaty under PTC 3 and PTC 10. And I think that's great, because for the first time in over 150 years, we're starting to actually think about the original founding document. I don't believe it was a founding document, or if it was, it's very much retrospectively a founding document. But we'll talk about that in a minute or two. And again, that's what I'm aiming to do from this session. Okay, I'm going to show you a couple of cartoons first. Now, this is a cartoon, and just in case you can't read it, it says a couple of Indians sitting on a hill, they're looking down at the Mayflower, and they're saying, oh, let them stay for a while, what possible harm can they do? And we juxtapose that cartoon with this one here, where a Māori guy is looking at his mates over here. Interesting little thing over here that a Minhinnick was still within the ignore, because he's using the plural. You don't use plural with Māori, it's just singular, Māori, you know. But anyway, it says the appearance of the British Navy in the Pacific could have serious consequences for us Māori. So if you juxtapose that one with that one, what I'm going to ask you to do is see if you can write down on your sheet, on the little retrieval sheet, what's the key idea that links the two cartoons. Very quickly, write down an idea, and you're going to do this in your pens. You're going to share it in a minute. When you're both happy with your answer, you can talk to each other. Write down the key idea that links the two cartoons. I'll flash them up before you again. There's the American one, and there's the New Zealand one. What's the idea that links the two? You make a noise, that's good. Okay, that's good. It's a quick activity to get you thinking at the first introduction of migrants from overseas to New Zealand in this case, and America in the previous case. So what is the idea? Someone like to venture forth their response to that, please. What's the key idea that links the two? Okay, Jaleesa?
Colonisation is the next question.
It is, colonisation, it is absolutely there. But wouldn't you say there's another dimension about their attitude here too?
I see lack of understanding on the side of the natives.
Absolutely, lack of understanding of what could possibly happen, and, you know, to these new migrants coming into the country, and a sort of sense of foreboding, really. Now, I'll put a few more cartoons through this presentation. I really like Tom Scott cartoons, and these ones I'll put down later on. Okay, so let's get the agenda or the program. What I'm going to deal with, I'm going to deal with the treaty at 1840, because that's where it all starts. It still kind of stems back to that. It doesn't really, because what's probably more important for PTC3 is the principles of the treaty, not the actual treaty itself. And so what we're going to look at is span those kind of 5 key ideas: the Treaty 1840, the Wars of the 1860s, which is the laminated sheet that I've given you, the laws 1860s onwards, and then the kind of key part, which is the ignore, leading into the principles at the end. So we'll see how we go. So this cartoon here is a cartoon. They're looking at the sophistry that goes around interpretation of words in the treaty, and that's what Tom Scott's talking about in this cartoon. That, you know, how you interpret different things. Like, for example, here, undisturb is the key word here. What could be more disturbing to a fish than being trapped in a net? That's brilliant. The Maori could own all the fish, but they wouldn't be able to catch any. Well done, sir. So they're looking at the sophistry around the language that you use when you're interpreting documents. Now there's a catch to that, because I have summarised here, at this stage, arguably 2 versions of the treaty, the English version and the Maori version. But there is, of course, a catch to that, because they're not just 2 versions of the treaty. In fact, I use the phrase understandings, because if you think about it, and you don't have to think very much, if the treaty is being read in English, most Māori in 1840 wouldn't understand it, because they don't understand English. All right? So they're going to understand the Māori version, and they're not going to be able to read it in Māori because they're not literate. So they're going to listen to it. So that it immediately introduces a 3rd version, the oral version, the listened to version. If you know anything about Māori culture, the listened version is actually very important to them. All right? So at the time of the treaty, we're going to look at just the understandings here, because that's quite pivotal to what happens later on in the century. That's why we're kind of going for this collective part here. So basically, Article 1 in the English version transfers sovereignty from Māori to Queen Victoria, Queen Victoria. On the Māori side, Article 1 transfers kawanatanga to Queen Victoria. So we're going to ask ourselves, do we think that sovereignty is the same word as kawanatanga? So if we investigate that just a little bit, not much, we've got to know that the only textbook that Maori would have had who are learning English would have been the Bible, because the missionaries set up the first mission schools, and the conception of kawana would be that of the governor of Judea, Pontius Pilate, that person is not a sovereign. As Pontius Pilate, he's less than the sovereign. So the kawanatanga, the governor, which is what kawanatanga means, governorship, Maori are transferring the governorship of New Zealand to Queen Victoria, but not sovereignty. And sovereignty, I would argue, is actually a superior status word. Sovereignty is far more important. Now, keep that in mind, because you're going to get to an opportunity to do a little explanation with that one in a minute. Now, the second article, because it's not a big deal, the treaty, the second article guarantees Māori possession of their lands and forests and fisheries. It includes a second component to it, and that is preemption. Now, preemption simply means that if land is to be sold, it must be offered or sold to the Crown first. So they have kind of first right to actually buy land, all right? Now, Māori's understanding guaranteed them not possession, but rangatiratanga, and that means chieftainship. Now, chieftainship was used because Māori was not a country where they had a king. Māori was a country of several chiefs. Even with the biggest one in the country, which is Taitokara, Ngāpui, the biggest iwi in the country, there's a lot of rangatira there, all of whom are important in their own sense. So this was guaranteed to them under Article 2. So you could argue, because of the nature of the society at the time, that rangatiratanga was far more important to Māori. Why? Because the treaty guaranteed their chieftainship here under Article 2. It also guaranteed them that they interpreted preemption as the right of first offer. So in other words, the Crown could offer to buy land from them, and if they couldn't agree on a price, then they could offer on the free market. All right? Complication, of course, with Māori was multiple ownership. Not one Māori owned a block of land. It was all multiple ownership, and that's something that gets addressed later on in the century. They also guaranteed them their access or their freedom to always be able to use their taonga, treasures. And there's a kind of a fluidity about the interpretation of the word taonga by way of treasures, because language is also a treasure. Okay, so how you interpret taonga, if you are Māori, is a bit different from just possession of lands, forests and fisheries. It's a little bit broader than that. And that's really the issues that the Waitangi Tribunal is addressing right now. That's part of the issue now, because at least they've taken that, so yes, we're accepting that. And the third one is the rights and privileges of an Englishman. So you've got English version, understanding, sovereignty transferred, possession guaranteed, preemption, British have got or the colonists have got the right of exclusively buying land. So really, you've got, broad picture, two different understandings of what they were signing. You've also got the situation where some people didn't sign it. Now, in point of fact, as you research a little bit more, you know that it didn't matter if in 1860, 20 years after the treaty, you didn't sign it, because there were so many Europeans in the country by then that they might as well have signed it, because the momentum had got so big by then that it was as if they had signed it. So at this stage here, we're looking at these two contrasting understandings of the treaty. Okay, so this is an interesting little slide. Before I get to the little activity, I'm just going to show you a couple of things. As we know more about history, we find out, and Crillia Orange tells us this, that this is an incorrect picture of the signing of the treaty, and you see it on lots of documentation. Now, it's incorrect because Hobson is actually in his viceregal uniform. But in fact, on the day of the signing, 6th of February, he was actually in mufti. He'd been called off his boat first thing in the morning to come and say, let's get on with the signing. And they did that, and he was actually dressed in civvies, in his mufti uniform, not in his viceregal uniform. And yet, they tried to up the ante on the status of the occasion by putting them all into their viceregal uniform. So the picture did tell a lie in this case. Okay, now I'm going to get you to sound quickly. Now, in your pairs, I want you to define those terms as best you can from what I've just said. It's retelling what I've just talked to you about. So it gives you a chance to think about it. Tell me what you think they would share between you, those terms to me. So it's reasserting the idea. Okay? Do that now, please. That's all right, Keith.
Sovereignty.
Okay, that's fine. So you, yeah, no. Okay.
Well, I mean,
Move on.
sovereignty.
This is good.
Of the, so like the
You're doing well.
yeah. Ultimately, they
Well, that's one the other one is chief as for the ranga in the English and they didn't have so they were kind of keeping it in there. That's what they were doing. Keep the sovereignty.
really, yeah.
But the Jews could
This is good. This is what I wanted. Now listen, just come. If I had a class and I was talking to them about this, I'd spend more time on that part there because I want the discussion. I want you talking and clarifying your understanding with each other. That's the key. But you're adults, and I'm going to move you on a little bit because I'm going to hook back on some of these ideas later on, and you've got them in front of you, and you've also got a bit of a kind of a rough idea of what they might mean. And I've given you a bit of a clue over here, which is a bit of a pivotal concept. that under Maori society, it's a tribal-based society, so there are lots of iwi, and really lots of hapu as well. That's kind of an extra complication in Māoridom, because in, say, for example, Taitokoro, Northland, you find that the hapu are so strong that their rangatira of a hapu is actually as important as the rangatira of an iwi from other parts of the country, because they're a lot smaller. So it's a relative concept, but the rangatira is a chief, and that's the basis of the society. And you'll see some of the changes to that happening on that little diagram over there. And of course, in England, they've been through their turmoil previously. They've got one sovereign, and certainly in 1840, they've got, I always say to my year 13 students, they've got a 17-year-old queen, because she's 17 when she comes to the throne. You think she's the same age as you as year 13 students. And I said, and yet she rules this bloody great big empire, and she's got her proxies going around different parts of the world establishing the British Empire. But she is a sovereign, all right? And this diagram over here really talks about the scope of the wars over this time period. Now, I'm not going to go into the detail, I'm just going to give you some big ideas, but the concepts that I've presented to you already are going to be reasserted through this particular little laminated sheet and the one that's on here. So what I want you to do first, big picture, have a look at the sheet and see if you can see anything that contrasts, any reason why this side of the diagram should contrast with this side of the diagram. Can you see anything in there that might contrast the two sides of the laminated sheet? Start at the top. Keep in mind what I've said over here. They're all acting to their understanding of the treaty, aren't they? So if you're English, you say, well, we've got sovereignty, Article 1, there it is, boom. Everything that they do over here is actually acting as if they have got sovereignty. Why? Article 1, English version says, yep, sovereignty. Over here, everything Maori does on this side is acting in relation to them asserting their rangatira. Why? Because that's what they got. It's guaranteed. Article 2 of the treaty. It said, yep, we're all right. Sweet. All right. So that diagram wasn't written by me, by the way. It was written by a lady called Diane Northcott, who was the head of history at Epsom Girls Grammar. But I thought it's a wonderful way of just scanning that time period. Because over here, let's look at this one over here. This period from 1840 to 1870 was a time of competing understandings of what sovereignty and rangatira really meant to each other, to both groups, all right? And what is absolutely pivotal in this is really this time period here, because it's this time period here, 1858, in fact I can put it down to one date, because at that time period, the population is 50-50 for the first time. So 1840 treaty signed, 18 years later, boom, you've got 50-50 in the population. And that's quite pivotal, because at that time, they'd already had some wars in the north, and really no land was taken, no punishment was made to Parihaka and Kawiti, no punishment at all, because really Governor Grey didn't have the numbers to actually keep on pursuing them and defeat them. But over here, from a Maori point of view, Maori had asserted their mana because Parihaka was really brassed off that they immediately shifted the capital to Auckland. So all of a sudden, all his trade died up. He actually had thought, yep, I'll sign this. In fact, he was the first one to sign the treaty, but he was also one of the first people to object to it in about 1845 or so, where he said, look, all of a sudden I've got the Europeans up the north. They're all going down to Auckland. I don't want to go to Auckland. And so he was miffed. Why? Because his rangatiratanga, his chieftainship, was affected by them asserting their sovereignty and moving the capital down to Auckland. Interesting, you see? And you get these things, these clashes occurring right throughout this time period where it's a competing assertion, the two different understandings going. That's really early days, 1845. It's really early. So I say that's quite a pivotal date, and I'm throwing a few pivotal dates to you because the next exercise is getting you to kind of have a bit of a discussion about what you think is pivotal. So clearly, there's two things that happened in 1858. One, population 50-50. All these migrants have flooded into the country under the Wakefield schemes and so on, and Maori decide that the only way that they can compete with Europeans is to have a king themselves. And so they establish this king movement that germinates in the mid-50s and comes to a head in 1858 where they create the first king for the Māori movement, the Kingitanga movement. Now the problem there was, of course, that Māori who have rangatira don't want to put their mana beneath that of somebody else who's going to become a king. It's a new concept for them. And of course, what did a lot of them do? They didn't join Kingitanga. Ironically, the Manapui didn't join Kingitanga. The biggest tribe, the biggest iwi in the country did not join the Kingitanga movement. The closest it came to it was Dame Te Atirangi Kahu was married to a Ngāpuhi guy. It's kind of a mixed marriage. But his iwi did not really join Kingitanga. He only did it because he had to live at Ngārawahi with his wife, but he was Ngāpuhi. So it's interesting. So it's another complication, but they're trying to match Queen Victoria on this side, asserting her sovereignty through her governors and so on, with what they create themselves. And of course, the European governors at the time decided that that was a threat to them. They've set this Kingitanga movement up because part of what they did was to resist land sales. They said, well, we're not going to allow any more land sales to occur in Waikato in particular. Now it's interesting, if you look at farmland in New Zealand, there's two primo farming areas in the North Island of New Zealand, Waikato and Taranaki. Absolutely primo, beautiful land and so on. And so that's why the wars occurred over here, and really, both in Taranaki and in Waikato, the reasons for the war starting were trumped up by the governor, the two governors of the day. First of all, Governor Gore Brown in Taranaki, and secondly by George Grey in Waikato. And you can't tell me that it wasn't a preemptive strike by Governor Grey, because in order to do that, he ordered a special flat-bottom boat in Sydney, being built in Sydney, so he could bring it across here and it could traverse the Waikato River, come across the bar, and then such have a shallow draft that it would be able to bombard the sites down the Waikato River as they came down into the Waikato. And these are all the campaigns, the wars that are fought over the 1860s. And then there was a few other ones over on the east coast where you get to Koti and then Te Takawaru. And that's actually something he will come back in later too. Okay, so Pākehā don't really achieve decisive victory, but it's really through the weapon of law, and that's where we're transitioning from war as a method to achieve you. It's very expensive to wage war, as they found out because the British government was in India, the British government said, we're actually not going to finance it anymore. So they had to find other ways of actually asserting their understanding of that side of the treaty, that sovereignty notion. And these acts start getting passed over here that actually start to assert the European understanding of sovereignty on the country of New Zealand. I'll give you a couple of examples here, because it's quite interesting. New Zealand Settlement Act legitimised the confiscations. Now, it's a really interesting name for an act, isn't it? The New Zealand Settlement Act, that legitimises what they call the ropatu, which is the confiscation of land of those people who are deemed to be rebels in a war that they didn't start. But they're rebels because they fought back. Taranaki and Waikato in particular, but also Bay of Plenty. Those areas were the rebel areas, if you like, and of course they confiscated their land. Okay, but they called the act, I think this is a cheek. The New Zealand, why didn't they call it the New Zealand Confiscation of Land Act, or the New Zealand, rip off the Māori Act, They didn't have to call it the New Zealand Settlement Act. I think it was rubbing it in, because that brings it back to land, you see, the acquisition of land, all right? Native Lands Act, we'll talk about those a little bit later, but this one here, this is really interesting, because if the first settlers that came in were missionaries, and all the schools that were set up were actually mission schools. And I said to you before, the first textbook was the Bible. And so they translated the Bible from English into Maori, and hey, all of a sudden, Maori could actually access literacy. It was magic sort of thing. Incidentally, they took 10 years to get their first conversion. You know, it took a long time before they triggered onto this, but all the native schools, the language of instruction was Maori. So the missionaries learnt Maori and taught those kids in the schools through the language of instruction being, the immersive language being Maori. In 1867 over here, when they passed this act, guess what happens? Completely reversed that notion. So right, language of instruction from now on, totally English. We got reversed, and yet they'd educated quite a lot of Maori, or that, who'd been to native schools and had learnt in Maori, and then used that as a bridge into English, because that was the key. Interesting that we didn't find this out as scholars, as teachers of English as a second language, Michael. We didn't find this out until about 15 years ago, that the best way for kids to learn another language is to actually have the language of first instruction from your parents in their strongest language. So Samoan kids coming to New Zealand, Tongan kids coming to New Zealand, are best if they have an immersive experience in their first language of their parents, and then that transitions conceptually into English later on. And I see that now with those kids that go to immersive kura, in other words, those total immersion kura, they're there, and I plot the astral results, and they're quite low to start off with in term 1, but by crikey, by year 10, they have really picked up because they've had good conceptual understanding in Māori, and that's a bridge into English when they come into secondary school that's not taught by immersion. I find that very interesting, and it's totally consistent with this, which is a lesson, a weapon of assimilation to try and convert them. So, oh well, we've got the numbers now, we can start to assert this. And this one over here, very interesting as well, Māori Representation Act, because they set up this constitution, 1852 constitution over here, and in the constitution they did not allow Māori to vote. The reason for that was that the franchise was a property franchise. As long as you own property. Now what's the problem with Māori? They owned land collectively. They didn't own land individually. So no Māori voted in the first election. And it wasn't until 1867 that they finally set up some special Māori seats. But initially, 1852, the first election was held in 1854, and no Māori were able to vote and be represented in Parliament because they couldn't vote. Okay, now I'm going to get you to have a look at the contrast, and I'm going to move around a little bit here. Actually, there's a bit too many for that. I think just keep you in little groups. What I want you to do is think, and together, write it onto the little sheet that I've given, the retrieval sheet. What do you think, from what I've talked about so far, are 3 pivotal points, change points, in the relationship between Māori and Parihaka over that period, 1840 to 1870. You put your view, have a talk to your neighbour, and you put your view down, see if you can come up with a little view. It gives you a break from listening to me.
So do you mean like events?
It could be an event, it could be something that's happened, a race show or something like that, whatever. You put down, you're contesting it. That's your historical, it's contestability. So do that quickly. I'll give you about 3 minutes of that. Give you time to
I think they just say
It's good.
Population shift. You don't have
that's what I mean. Oh, yeah, love that.
it's such a big reason as to why the government
Well, I think the wars definitely would have changed the relationship. Like my year and everything.
I could have this in this colour, and this colour, and this.